You miserable son of a bitch. I gave you my heart, I gave you my soul, I gave you my body, and you just threw me aside like I was some piece of garbage.
Yeah, my bad.
A grand piano falls from a clear blue sky and crushes a man standing on a beach house porch. The crowd doesn't gasp. They laugh. Because everyone watching already knows who that man is supposed to be, and everyone watching has been waiting 4 years for exactly this moment. That single image, broadcast on February 19, 2015, became the most talked about 60 seconds in the history of network sitcoms, and it wasn't really a joke about a falling piano at all. It was the final word in a feud that had already ended one actor's career, nearly sunk an entire production, and turned a beloved comedy into a cautionary tale. To understand why that piano fell, you have to go back to a much smaller, much quieter moment years earlier, when a show about a carefree bachelor, his uptight brother, and a kid caught in the middle was still just another mid-season CBS comedy trying to find its footing. 2.5 Men premiered in the fall of 2003, built around a simple, almost old-fashioned sitcom formula. A slick, irresponsible jingle writer named Charlie Harper shares his Malibu beach house with his newly divorced, neurotic chiropractor brother Alan and Alan's young son Jake. It was broad, occasionally crude, and unapologetically built around adult themes wrapped in a family hour time slot. Critics were unimpressed from the start, dismissing it as formulaic and predictable. Audiences disagreed almost immediately. Within a few seasons, the show had become one of the most watched comedies on American television, anchoring CBS's Monday night lineup and turning its 3 leads into household names. At the center of that success was Charlie Sheen, an actor whose off-screen reputation for chaos somehow made his on-screen character feel more authentic rather than less. Viewers weren't entirely sure where Charlie Harper ended and Charlie Sheen began, and that blurred line became the show's secret weapon. By the time the show entered its 8th season, Sheen wasn't just a sitcom star. He was, by most industry estimates, the highest-paid actor on television, pulling in roughly $1.8 million per episode. When his contract came up for renewal in 2010, he reportedly pushed for even more, and after a tense standoff with CBS and Warner Brothers, he ultimately secured a deal that pushed him close to $2 million an episode once back-end profits were factored in. It was an enormous bet on one man's ability to keep showing up, keep delivering, and keep the show's most valuable asset functioning. That bet did not pay off the way anyone expected. What most viewers didn't see, at least not yet, was how unstable things had become behind the cameras. Sheen's history with addiction stretched back over a decade, including a cocaine overdose in the late 1990s that sent him to rehab for the first time. By the time 2.5 Men became a hit, that history hadn't disappeared, it had simply been managed, mostly out of public view. As the pressure of the show's success mounted, the cracks started showing again. There were reports of Sheen arriving on set in no condition to perform, of scenes being hastily rewritten because he couldn't remember his lines, of tension boiling over between him and the show's creator, Chuck Lorre, who Sheen reportedly clashed with over scripts and creative direction. None of that had fully broken into public consciousness yet. It was still, for the most part, an open secret inside a closed industry. That changed on Christmas Day in 2009, when Sheen was arrested following a domestic dispute with his then-wife Brooke Mueller at their Aspen home. It was a serious, public, and deeply damaging incident, the kind that would end most careers outright. Instead, after another stint in treatment, Sheen returned to work, and the show continued as though the machine simply couldn't be allowed to stop. That decision, to keep the engine running no matter what, set the stage for everything that followed. Production didn't just tolerate the chaos. In some ways, it had become dependent on it. The real unraveling began in January of 2011. CBS and Warner Brothers made the decision to halt production on the show entirely, officially to allow Sheen to seek treatment after another reported relapse. It was framed publicly as an act of concern, a studio trying to protect its star and give him room to recover. What actually happened next looked nothing like recovery. Rather than retreating from the spotlight, Sheen seemed to lean directly into it. There were widely reported stories of marathon parties lasting more than a day, ending with a trip to the hospital. When asked about his condition afterward, Sheen brushed it off entirely, telling reporters that he had essentially willed himself back to health, famously remarking that he had simply closed his eyes and made it so. It was the first hint that what was coming wouldn't resemble a typical celebrity rehab story. It was going to be something far stranger and far more public.
Then came the radio interview. In February of 2011, Sheen called into a syndicated radio show and unleashed a rant that would define the next several weeks of entertainment news. He turned his fire directly on Chuck Lorre, hurling insults at the man who had created the show that made him famous. at one point invoking Law's Hebrew name in a way many listeners and commentators found deliberately offensive. He claimed to possess what he called tiger blood and Adonis DNA. He referred to himself as a warlock. He challenged Law to some kind of confrontation. It would have been easy to write off as a single unhinged outburst, except Sheen didn't stop there. Over the following days, he gave interview after interview, each one stranger than the last, openly discussing extreme drug use in numbers that sounded almost performative, and coining the phrase that would follow him for the rest of his life: winning. Phrases that started as bizarre soundbites turned into genuine cultural catchphrases almost overnight. Repeated on talk shows, printed on t-shirts, turned into ringtones. When Sheen joined Twitter that March, he reportedly broke records for the fastest accumulation of 1 million followers. The country wasn't just watching a celebrity meltdown. It was actively participating in one, treating a man's public collapse like entertainment programming. For CBS and Warner Brothers, the calculation had officially flipped. What had once been a problem to be managed quietly had become a liability too large and too public to ignore. On March 7, 2011, Warner Brothers terminated Sheen's contract. The studio didn't soften the language. In a formal letter to Sheen's representatives, executives described his conduct as dangerous, accused him of jeopardizing the safety of his co-workers, and suggested his behavior may have crossed legal lines. It was an unusually blunt and public severing of ties with the highest-paid actor in television, and it came with real costs. Several remaining episodes of the season were scrapped outright, production shut down, and roughly 200 crew members were left without work, at least temporarily, as the studio scrambled to figure out what came next.
Sheen, predictably, didn't go quietly. Within days of his firing, he filed a lawsuit against Warner Brothers and Chuck Lorre seeking what was reported to be around $100 million, arguing that the studio had no legal right to fire him and framing the decision as retaliation rather than a legitimate response to his conduct. The case became a legal tug-of-war almost immediately, with Sheen's team pushing for a public jury trial while Warner Brothers insisted his contract required private arbitration instead. A judge eventually sided with the studio, sending the dispute behind closed doors. By that September, the two sides reached a confidential settlement. The exact terms were never fully disclosed, but reporting at the time suggested Sheen walked away with a substantial payout, likely tens of millions of dollars once back-end profit participation was included, a quiet end to a very loud fight. With Sheen gone and a hit show suddenly without its lead, CBS faced a problem that threatened to take the entire production down with him. The search for a replacement was chaotic almost by necessity, because there simply wasn't a roadmap for swapping out the central star of a long-running, character-driven sitcom mid-run. Reports circulated that Hugh Grant was in serious talks to take over the role, with a deal reportedly worth around $1 million per episode, only for those talks to collapse at the last minute over creative disagreements. With an advertiser presentation looming and no lead actor in place, the studio moved fast. Ashton Kutcher's name surfaced, negotiations accelerated, and within what felt like days, Kutcher had signed on, not to replace Charlie Harper, but to play an entirely new character. That distinction mattered enormously to how the show handled the transition. Rather than recasting the role and pretending nothing had happened, the writers chose to kill Charlie Harper off entirely, opening the 9th season premiere with his funeral, revealing he had died after being struck by a train in Paris, a fittingly chaotic and slightly absurd exit for a character built on chaos. Kutcher's new character, tech billionaire Walden Schmidt, was introduced as someone who buys Charlie's old beach house, an emotionally fragile, recently divorced man who is, in almost every way, the opposite of the character he was replacing. It was a clever bit of narrative engineering, allowing the show to continue without forcing comparisons between two actors playing the same part. Still, something fundamental had shifted. The show's center of gravity had moved, the chemistry was different, and even with strong premiere ratings driven largely by curiosity, the show never quite recaptured the cultural dominance it had during its Sheen years. It limped onward for 3 more seasons, increasingly a show running on inertia rather than momentum, propped up by a loyal but shrinking audience and a creative team clearly aware that the story's real climax had already happened off-screen. Which brings us back to that piano. By the time the series finale aired in February 2015, everyone involved understood exactly what the audience was actually waiting for. It wasn't closure for Walden, or Alan, or even really for Jake, whose return as a surprisingly successful adult gave the show a sentimental final beat. It was closure for the Charlie Sheen story, and the writers, led by Chuck Lorre himself, decided not to offer a gentle goodbye. Instead, they built an elaborate misdirection. Promotional materials hinted for weeks that Charlie Harper might somehow return, stoking speculation that Sheen himself could make a surprise cameo. Sheen fed the rumor mill too, publicly joking the day before the finale that fans wouldn't see him, while refusing to clarify whether he was being honest or simply trolling his old show one last time. Scripts for the episode were reportedly kept locked down, with even guest performers receiving only partial pages, ensuring the surprise stayed intact. Then, in the episode's final moments, a man resembling Charlie Harper appears outside the beach house, rings the doorbell, and is instantly crushed by a grand piano falling from above. It's played completely straight, no slow build, no dramatic music sting, just a sudden, almost cartoonish act of violence against a character the audience had spent over a decade with. As the camera pulls back, it reveals Chuck Lorre himself, seated nearby, watching the wreckage. He looks directly into the camera, utters Sheen's own catchphrase, winning, and a second piano drops, crushing him too. In under 15 seconds, the show's creator had scripted his own on-screen death directly beside a stand-in for the man who had spent years publicly tormenting him, and used Sheen's most infamous phrase as the punchline. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't meant to be. For an audience that had lived through years of tabloid headlines, radio rants, and lawsuits, the moment landed as something between a joke and a verdict, equal parts hilarious and a little vindictive, depending entirely on which side of the feud you'd been rooting for. The reaction was immediate and enormous. Social media exploded with commentary within minutes, talk shows dissected the scene for days afterward, and entertainment outlets debated whether the gag was a clever piece of metacomedy or simply Lorre settling an old score on national television using a multi-million-dollar production budget. Sheen himself eventually weighed in publicly, calling the piano drop silly but admitting he found it genuinely funny, even joking that he felt oddly honored to have inspired his own cartoonish demise. Whatever the intent, the scene accomplished something rare. It gave a long-running, somewhat fatigued sitcom an ending that people actually talked about, turning what could have been a quiet fade-out into a genuine cultural moment one last time. In the years since, the cast scattered into very different lives. John Cryer, who played Alan for all 12 seasons, picked up Emmy recognition for the role and went on to steady, varied work afterward, eventually returning to series television as a lead in his own right. Angus T. Jones, who grew up on camera playing Jake, walked away from the show and from acting almost entirely after publicly criticizing its content while he was still a young cast member, a decision that strained relationships with his former co-stars and reshaped how the public saw him for years afterward.